The golden rays of dawn stretched lazily over the bustling airport, painting the tarmac in hues of amber and gold. Inside the private terminal, a man in his mid-40s adjusted the lapel of his simple navy blue jacket, his expression unreadable. To most, he appeared to be an unassuming traveler, perhaps someone catching a flight for business or pleasure. What no one could guess was that this quiet man was Matthew Greer, the enigmatic owner of Skylift Airlines, a man rarely seen, much less recognized. Matthew's success story was legendary in the aviation industry, but he had always preferred to stay behind the scenes. While his name was whispered in boardrooms and celebrated in glossy magazines, his face remained a mystery to the public. That anonymity was precisely what he sought to maintain as he prepared to board one of his own planes today, not as the owner, but as an ordinary passenger. This wasn't a whim or some eccentric play of curiosity. Matthew had recently been flooded with reports, some glowing, others trembling. Complaints about delays, whispers of indifferent crew members, and even claims of passengers feeling overlooked have reached his desk. The numbers on spreadsheets told one story, but Matthew believed the truth lay in the conversations of those who experienced his airline firsthand. If something was amiss, he needed to hear it for himself, unfiltered and raw. With his ticket in hand, Matthew blended into the crowd at the boarding gate. He'd chosen Flight 572, a routine cross-country journey from Chicago to San Francisco. It was an ordinary flight on paper, but Matthew suspected that no flight was ever truly ordinary when you listened closely enough. He scanned the other passengers, families juggling strollers and snacks, business travelers glued to their phones, a young couple whispering and giggling as they leaned into each other. Each person carried their own story, and Matthew was eager to hear them all, though he had no idea just how much he was about to uncover. Once on board, Matthew's seat was strategically chosen -27B, right in the middle of the economy section. No first-class luxury, no special treatment. Just the hum of engines, the chatter of strangers, and the occasional cry of a restless toddler. Settling into the cramped seat, he gave a polite nod to the woman seated next to him, who was already flipping through an in-flight magazine. The man in 27C was typing furiously on his laptop, muttering something about deadlines. The plane filled quickly, and as the final boarding call echoed through the cabin, a flurry of late arrivals shuffled past, stowing their bags and squeezing into seats. The atmosphere was a mix of quiet anticipation and mild frustration, the usual mood before takeoff. The flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, demonstrating safety protocols that only a handful of passengers seemed to watch. As the plane began to taxi, Matthew leaned back, closing his eyes momentarily, letting the white noise of engines and murmured conversations wash over him. He wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly, perhaps an authentic glimpse into the customer experience, perhaps a confirmation of the troubling reports that had reached him. What he didn't expect was how quickly things would take a turn. The voices behind him caught his attention first. They weren't loud, but they had a sharpness that cut through the ambient noise. Two men, perhaps in their 30s, were engaged in a heated yet hushed conversation. "I'm telling you, it's a scam," one of them said, his tone laced with frustration. "They say they're upgrading their fleet, but where's the proof? The same old planes, the same cramped seats. I'm sick of it." "Yeah," the other replied, his voice lower, but no less bitter. "And don't get me started on how they handle delays. Remember last month? Stuck on the tarmac for hours with no explanation." Matthew's heart sank. These were the exact kinds of complaints that had reached his office, but hearing them spoken so bluntly, so angrily, made them feel far more real. He resisted the urge to turn around, to interject, to explain. This wasn't the time for defense. It was a moment to listen. As the plane climbed into the sky, the conversation behind him continued, punctuated by occasional laughter that felt more cynical than amused. But it wasn't just them. To Matthew's left, a middle-aged woman was on a call, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, it's fine," she said, though the tension in her tone suggested otherwise. "I just hope we get there on time. You know how unreliable these flights can be." Matthew's stomach tightened. This wasn't the image he wanted for his airline. He had always prided himself on creating a brand that people trusted, that people loved. But the more he listened, the more he realized how disconnected he had become from the day-to-day realities of his customers. And then, just as he was beginning to feel the weight of these revelations, a different voice broke through. A cheerful, almost conspiratorial tone from the row directly behind him. "You know," a young woman said, "I read this crazy story about Skylight's CEO. Apparently he's never even flown on one of his own planes. Can you believe that? How out of touch can you be?" Matthew's breath caught. His pulse quickened. He kept his head down, his expression neutral, but inside his mind raced. If only she knew how wrong she was at this very moment. Yet, her words stung more than he cared to admit. The hours stretched on, the plane soaring steadily westward. Each snippet of conversation Matthew overheard painted a more complex picture of his airline, and of the people who entrusted it with their journeys. Some spoke fondly of past experiences, while others vented their frustrations. But one thing became clear. This wasn't just about planes or policies. It was about people, real people with real expectations, hopes, and disappointments. As the flight neared its destination, Matthew found himself grappling with a mix of emotions. He had come here seeking answers, and he had found them. But they weren't the answers he had hoped for. Yet, amidst the complaints and criticisms, there was an undeniable undercurrent of possibility. Change was needed, and change was possible. But what that change would look like, Matthew wasn't sure, just as the captain announced the descent into San Francisco. A voice from the row behind him made Matthew freeze. It was low, almost a whisper, but the words were unmistakable. "I'm just saying," the man murmured, "if people knew what was really going on with this airline, they'd think twice before booking another flight." Matthew's pulse quickened. What did he mean? What was really going on? As the plane began its descent, Matthew's mind raced with questions, and he realized this journey was far from over. Whatever he had stumbled into, it was deeper than he could have imagined. Matthew's mind raced as the plane continued its descent. The words of the man behind him still echoed in his ears. If people knew what was really going on with this airline, what exactly did he mean? Was it a passing comment, or was there something deeper at play? He felt a knot form in his stomach. He had always known that there were challenges in the airline industry, delays, maintenance issues, the occasional customer complaint. But what this man implied suggested something far more serious, something hidden beneath the surface. The plane's engines whined as it descended toward San Francisco. But for Matthew, the world outside the window had gone quiet. He'd barely registered the stewardesses fastening seat belts or the low hum of conversation. His thoughts were focused solely on the cryptic words that had been spoken. There was no way he could ignore them. Not now. Not after everything he had just overheard. Matthew had built Skylift Airlines from the ground up, starting with a handful of planes and a simple vision. To create an airline that felt personal, that treated every passenger like a VIP, no matter how big or small their ticket was. He had always prided himself on being hands-on, meeting employees, talking to customers, and ensuring that the company stayed true to its mission. He knew the airline industry had its ups and downs, but he had always believed that with hard work and dedication, they could keep improving. But as the years passed, the company had grown. What started as a humble venture had evolved into a sprawling operation with thousands of employees and hundreds of planes. And somewhere along the way, Matthew had lost his grip on the very things that had made Skylift successful in the first place. He could no longer oversee everything himself. He had delegated. He had trusted his managers, his staff, and his executives to handle the day-to-day operations. He had trusted that the people in charge would uphold the company's values. But now, as he sat on this plane listening to the discontent of his passengers, he couldn't help but wonder if his trust had been misplaced. His thoughts were interrupted as the plane touched down on the runway, the tires screeching against the tarmac. The abrupt jolt of the landing brought him back to the present moment. The tension in the cabin eased slightly as the plane taxied toward the gate. Matthew straightened up in his seat, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had settled over him. The plane had arrived safely, and that was what mattered, right? But deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than a routine flight. As passengers began to gather their belongings and prepare to disembark, Matthew kept his eyes on the aisle. He was no longer interested in small talk or pleasantries. His mind was consumed with what he had heard, and he had to figure out what was really going on with his airline. He waited until the majority of passengers had exited the plane before he made his move. He didn't want to attract any attention or risk being recognized. Matthew had always kept a low profile, and he intended to keep it that way for now. He slipped out of his seat and walked toward the rear of the cabin, blending in with the last of the passengers who were slowly gathering their things. As he passed the row where the two men had been talking, he glanced over at them. They hadn't noticed him. They were too busy arguing about something else now. But he could still hear fragments of their conversation. "It's getting worse," the first man said, shaking his head. "They're cutting corners on everything. The planes are older, the service is worse, and now they're hiding it all from the customers." The second man nodded, his face grim. "You're right. They can only keep this up for so long before the truth comes out." The words sent a chill down Matthew's spine. What truth? What exactly were they talking about? He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, his mind spinning with questions. As he walked through the terminal toward baggage claim, he tried to keep his face neutral, but his thoughts were a whirlwind of suspicion and dread. The reports, the complaints, the overheard conversations, they were all starting to form a much bigger picture than he had ever anticipated. But what was the picture? What was he missing? Matthew pulled out his phone and quickly texted his assistant Jane, asking her to set up an emergency meeting with his top managers as soon as possible. He didn't want to wait. He needed answers. The feeling of being in control, of being the leader who steered his company with confidence, was slipping away. It was being replaced with a sense of vulnerability, a realization that maybe he hadn't been paying enough attention all this time. As he waited for his bag to arrive on the conveyor belt, Matthew overheard a group of employees from Skylift Airlines chatting nearby. They didn't notice him. Their conversation stopped him in his tracks. "You know what I heard?" One of them said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "There's been a lot of talk about cutbacks lately. They're trimming staff, reducing maintenance budgets." Another employee scoffed. "Of course. I don't know why anyone is surprised. The higher-ups have been acting weird lately. It's like they're preparing for something." Matthew's ears perked up. Cutbacks. Reducing maintenance. What was going on within his company? This was exactly what he had feared. His airline was starting to unravel behind the scenes. He had heard murmurs of financial trouble before, but he hadn't taken them seriously. Now, it seemed those whispers were more than just idle gossip. There was something happening at Skylift, something darker, something that threatened to bring everything crashing down. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of his phone. It was Jane. "Meeting set for 3 p.m. The team's waiting for you. What's going on? Is everything okay?" Matthew hesitated for a moment. What could he tell her? How could he explain that the very foundation of his company was beginning to crack without alarming her? He typed back quickly. "I'll explain everything later. Just make sure everyone's in the room at 3. It's important." With a sigh, he ended the conversation. The next few hours felt like an eternity as Matthew walked through the terminal, heading toward the parking garage. The questions in his mind only multiplied with each passing minute. What was really going on with his airline? Were the reports accurate? Had he lost control without even realizing it? As he sat in his car, staring at the San Francisco skyline, Matthew knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about a few bad reviews or customer complaints. There was something much more significant at play, something that threatened to destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. And he had no idea how deep it ran or how far it would go before the truth came to light. Matthew sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, his gaze fixed on the blurred lights of San Francisco in the distance. The weight of the morning's revelations pressed heavily on his chest, and the fear that something catastrophic was brewing within his airline was almost unbearable. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the mounting complaints, the rumors, and now the unsettling overheard conversations from the plane. This wasn't just a few disgruntled passengers. Something much bigger was unfolding. The idea of a company unraveling from the inside was a nightmare he had never truly considered. For years, he had surrounded himself with the best in the industry. Managers who seemed competent, employees who were loyal, and a carefully crafted business model that had earned Skylift its place among the top airlines. But now, those same people were the ones murmuring behind his back, the ones voicing concerns that Matthew could no longer ignore. It wasn't just talk anymore. It was the very pulse of the company, and it didn't feel right. He pulled into his driveway, the echo of the engine's hum fading into the silence of his home. The meeting with his management team was only a few hours away, but Matthew already felt a growing unease in his gut. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what was happening at Skylift, and he needed to do it before it spiraled out of control. Inside the house, he walked past the kitchen where his wife Sarah was preparing lunch. She glanced up as he entered but didn't say anything. Matthew's mood had been dark for weeks, and though she had tried to reach out, he had been distant. He hadn't told her about the escalating concerns of the airline. He didn't want to burden her with something that might only be a passing worry. But now he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. The cracks were widening, and it was only a matter of time before they would break wide open. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with concern as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. Matthew hesitated, looking at her, the question hanging in the air like a weight. How could he explain that the very foundation of his company might be crumbling? How could he tell her that the airline they had built together, the dream they had shared, could soon be nothing more than a memory? "I'm not sure," he said quietly, his voice thick with frustration. "There's something wrong at Skylift. I'm not sure what, but it's getting worse. I overheard some things today that don't sit right." Sarah put down the towel and walked toward him, her eyes searching his face. "What kind of things?" Matthew shook his head, as if trying to shake the weight off. "People are talking, Sarah. Employees, passengers. They're saying there's something going on behind the scenes. Complaints about delays, corners being cut, maintenance issues, and that's just the start. People are starting to whisper that there's something much bigger happening, something that could ruin everything." Sarah's expression softened, but the concern in her eyes only deepened. "What are you going to do?" Matthew stared at the floor, a storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He could feel the pressure building, the realization that the answers he sought might not be the ones he wanted to hear. He had to confront the issue head on, but he didn't know where to begin. The company had so many moving parts, so many people involved, and each conversation only raised more questions. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I have to find out. I can't let it keep spiraling like this." As he left Sarah to finish preparing lunch, Matthew's thoughts turned back to the upcoming meeting. It was time to face his team and get the answers he needed. But part of him dreaded what he might uncover. What if the company was already too far gone? What if the things he had ignored were now beyond repair? The thought gnawed at him. Later that afternoon, Matthew stood at the head of the conference table, surrounded by his management team. The room was sterile, the whiteboard gleaming in the fluorescent light. He had requested this emergency meeting without much explanation, and the team had arrived with puzzled expressions, all eager to hear what he had to say. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Matthew began, his voice steady, though his mind raced. He could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him, a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "I've been hearing troubling reports about the state of the company, and I need to know if what I'm hearing is true. I want complete honesty. If there are issues, I need to know." There was a brief silence before Jason, his CFO, cleared his throat. "What exactly have you been hearing, Matthew?" Matthew glanced at him, his expression tight. "I've heard complaints about the maintenance schedules, about service delays, and about customer experiences. And more than that, I've heard rumors that we're cutting corners in areas that could put us at risk." Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Matthew's gaze. "I'm not sure where these rumors are coming from, but I can assure you you're operating at full capacity. Yes, there are some delays, But that's just the nature of the business. Everyone is dealing with it. I'm hearing more than just delays, Matthew pressed. I'm hearing about safety concerns, employee morale plummeting, corners being cut in areas that shouldn't be. This isn't just a few disgruntled passengers. This is about something deeper. I want to know the truth. There was an awkward pause before Claire, the VP of Operations, spoke up. Matthew, we've been pushing hard to expand. We've had to prioritize certain projects, and yes, some areas might not be up to the standard we'd like. But we've been dealing with a lot of external pressures, competition, rising fuel costs, and maintenance challenges. Matthew's eyes narrowed. External pressures or internal mismanagement? Claire flinched, her eyes darting to Jason, who immediately straightened up. We've had challenges, yes, but we're handling them. The tension in the room thickened. Matthew could feel the cracks beginning to show, the walls of his company trembling under the weight of the secrets being kept. This wasn't just about a few cutbacks. This was something bigger, something that none of them were willing to admit. But what could he do now? The damage had already been done. And the more he listened, the more he realized that the truth was slipping further out of his reach. The words of the passengers, rumors, and now his own team's reluctance to face the truth. It all painted a picture of a company in crisis. But no one seemed willing to acknowledge just how deep the problem ran. The meeting dragged on, but Matthew barely heard the words. His mind was elsewhere, processing the fragments of information that didn't quite add up. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was hiding something, that the real issue was being buried beneath layers of corporate jargon and half-truths. As the meeting ended, Matthew's stomach twisted with unease. He had gotten nothing, absolutely nothing, that helped him understand the full scope of the problem. His team was either in denial or too afraid to speak up. And with each passing day, the mystery deepened, one that he wasn't sure he would be able to solve before it was too late. As Matthew walked out of the conference room, the weight of the day's events pressed down on him like an invisible force. The meeting had only confirmed his worst fears. Something was wrong, but no one was willing to admit it. The cracks in his company were there, spreading wider with each passing day, but no one seemed to want to face them head-on. Instead, they danced around the issue, offering excuses and half-hearted reassurances, none of which gave him any real answers. He stepped into the elevator, the familiar hum of the mechanism doing nothing to calm the storm raging inside him. The walls of the building seemed to close in on him as the floors passed by, each one reminding him that his company, the one he had built from nothing, was spiraling out of control. The truth was there, just beyond his reach, but he couldn't quite grasp it. It was as though every time he came closer, the pieces slipped further away. When the elevator doors opened, Matthew was greeted by the sight of his assistant Jane, waiting for him with a file in her hands. She looked at him with a mixture of concern and confusion, and as soon as she saw the look on his face, she knew something was wrong. "Matthew, what's going on?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with worry. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I'm not sure anymore. The team is either hiding something, or they're in complete denial. I don't know who to trust." Jane hesitated, her gaze shifting nervously. "I've been hearing things too, Matthew. People are talking about the company, about the cuts, about how things aren't what they seem. I don't think it's just passengers anymore. It's the staff too." Matthew's heart sank. This was the confirmation he had been dreading, but it was also the push he needed. If the staff was talking openly, it meant the cracks weren't just confined to boardrooms and executive offices. They were starting to spread throughout the company. He had to act quickly. The question was, how? "I need to go over the financials again," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to see everything. I have to know what's really going on, Jane." She nodded, her expression a mix of worry and understanding. "I'll have everything ready for you by the time you get back to your office. But Matthew, you need to be careful. I don't think this is just about bad management or financial missteps. Something's off." Matthew glanced up at her, a flash of frustration in his eyes. "I know, I feel it too. But right now, I don't have time to figure out what it is. I need answers, and I need them fast." He walked past her, heading toward his office, each step feeling heavier than the last. His mind was spinning with everything he had overheard, everything he had seen, and yet nothing was adding up. The airline was his life. He had put everything into it. And now, as he walked into his office and sat down at his desk, it was hard to shake the feeling that it was all slipping away like sand through his fingers. Hours passed as Matthew pored over the files, spreadsheets, and reports that Jane had gathered. The numbers didn't lie, but they didn't tell the whole story either. He saw discrepancies in the budget, unexplained expenses, and most concerning of all, massive cuts to maintenance funds. It was exactly what he had feared. The cuts were real. But the more he dug, the more he realized that these cuts weren't accidental. Someone had made deliberate choices, cutting corners in areas that could jeopardize the safety of passengers and the integrity of the airline itself. But who and why? As the evening stretched on, Matthew felt like he was on the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss. He was getting closer to the truth, but the more he uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. He had seen corruption in companies before, but this was different. It wasn't just about money or mismanagement. It was about something far more insidious. Just as he was about to make another call, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Matthew, I think I found something. Call me when you can." His heart skipped a beat. What had she found? Was she involved in this somehow? He quickly dialed her number, his fingers trembling as he held the phone to his ear. The line rang twice before she picked up. "Matthew," Sarah's voice was strained. "I don't know how to say this, but I think I've stumbled onto something that could explain all of this." Matthew sat up straight, his heart racing. "What is it? What did you find?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I've been doing some digging on my own. You know how you've been hearing all these rumors about corners being cut? Well, I think I found out who's behind it." Matthew felt a cold chill run down his spine. Who was behind it? Could it be one of the people he trusted the most? "Who?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I think it's your CEO, Brian," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "He's been involved in some questionable dealings. I didn't want to believe it at first, but after looking at his recent activities, it's all pointing to him. He's the one pushing the cuts and making sure certain things don't get looked into." Matthew's mind reeled. Brian, the man who had been with Skylift from the beginning? The one who had always been his most loyal ally? It didn't make sense. But then again, none of this made sense anymore. He couldn't ignore what Sarah had found. "I need to meet with him," Matthew said, his voice low, his mind already racing with the possibilities. "I need to confront him." As soon as the words left his mouth, the gravity of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. If Sarah was right, Brian had been orchestrating the very downfall of the company Matthew had worked so hard to build. And if that was the case, there was only one thing left to do: expose him. But Matthew couldn't shake the fear that had lodged itself deep in his chest. What if he was wrong? What if confronting Brian would only make things worse? Would Brian deny everything, or worse, would he turn the tables on Matthew? The tension in the air was thick with uncertainty, and Matthew knew that his next move could change everything.